Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about cats. Specifically, we're going to talk about Victorian cats. Cats in bonnets, cats in wedding dresses, cats arranged at tiny tea tables with miniature cups and saucers, cats photographed with such elaborate care and such evident delight that the resulting images have survived 150 years and are currently, as you have perhaps noticed if you spend any time on the internet, going viral again, because it turns out that nothing brings people together across the centuries quite like a cat in a tiny hat. But tonight, we're not just going to look at the pictures. Tonight, we're going to understand them, because the Victorian obsession with dressing up pet cats was not random, and it was not simply the equivalent of someone putting sunglasses on their dog for a funny Instagram post. It was the product of a specific cultural moment. A moment when the entire relationship between human beings and domestic animals was being renegotiated, when the cat specifically was undergoing a transformation in its social status that was genuinely extraordinary, when photography was new enough that the choice of what to photograph still meant something, and when the particular anxieties and longings and humour of the Victorian middle class were finding expression in the most unlikely possible place. Before we get into it, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps, and there's a lot more of this coming. Alright, let's begin. The year is 1880. You are a middle-class woman in London, and you have a cat. You have had cats before, in the vague background sense that many households had cats. Working animals, more or less. Kept because they kept the mice down. Fed table scraps, if they were fed deliberately at all, sleeping wherever they chose because no one had particularly decided where they ought to sleep, neither fully inside the category of pet, nor fully outside it, occupying that intermediate zone that cats in particular seem to find natural, and that other domestic animals seem to find less comfortable. But this cat is different. Or rather, your relationship to this cat is different, which amounts to the same thing from the cat's perspective, which is not particularly interested in being categorized. This cat has a name, not a working name, not the cat or puss, which is what the household cats of your mother's generation were called, but an actual name, a specific name, the kind of name you might give a person. Yours is called Marmaduke, which you chose because Marmaduke has a specific quality of expression that you have decided is aristocratic, and the name fits him in a way that makes you and your sister laugh every time someone uses it with full seriousness, which everyone now does. Marmaduke sleeps in the parlour, not in the kitchen, not in the scullery, in the parlour, on a specific chair that has been reupholstered once already because he destroyed the previous fabric. He is fed, not table scraps, but food that was prepared with him in mind. Cooked fish, mostly, occasionally a bit of chicken, and he gets milk every morning from a small bowl that sits on the floor near the fire. This is not how cats lived in Britain 30 years ago. This is something new. To understand why 1880 looks different from 1850, you have to understand what happened to the Victorian middle class over the course of the 19th century, and specifically what happened to their homes, their leisure time, and their relationship to the idea of the private domestic sphere. The middle class that was expanding rapidly through the mid-Victorian period was a class that had by and large made its money through trade and commerce and the professions, solicitors, merchants, manufacturers, clerks, managers of the new industrial economy. Not aristocracy, not working class, a class that was permanently anxious about its own status, permanently in the process of defining and redefining what it meant to be respectable, and that invested heavily in the home as the primary site of respectability. The Victorian home was not simply a place where people lived, it was a statement. The parlour, the formal front room where guests were received, was specifically designed and maintained as a display, a curated presentation of the family's taste, their refinement, their moral character, their standing. The objects in the parlour mattered, the furniture mattered, the piano mattered. The quality and quantity of the ornaments on the mantelpiece mattered, and increasingly, the animals in the parlour mattered. The elevation of the pet from working animal to family member, from creature tolerated for its utility to creature valued for its companionship, is a Victorian development with a very specific timeline. In the early Victorian period, the keeping of pets was well established among the aristocracy and the upper classes, but it carried different meanings and different practices at different levels of society. A working-class family might have a dog that was primarily a watchdog or a ratter. A middle-class family might have a dog that was partly companion and partly utility, moving toward pet, but not quite there yet. By the 1860s and 1870s, the explicit keeping of animals purely for companionship, animals that served no practical function, animals that were expensive to feed and maintain, animals that justified their existence entirely by the pleasure they gave their owners, was becoming not just acceptable but fashionable among the expanding middle class. This shift was not simply economic, though economics were part of it. Greater prosperity meant that more families could afford to feed an animal that didn't earn its keep. It was ideological. The Victorians were, as a culture, deeply interested in childhood and children, in innocence and in the specific quality of uncomplicated affection that children were supposed to represent. Animals, and pets especially, participated in this ideology. A pet was a creature that loved you simply, without calculation, without the social complexity that characterized human relationships in a world as status-conscious as the Victorian middle class. A pet was innocent. A pet required care. A pet, in a certain domestic ideological sense, was a kind of permanent child, for women especially, and we will come back to this because the relationship between Victorian women and their pet cats is the central current of tonight's story. The pet was an entity in their domestic domain over which they had genuine authority and genuine responsibility in a world that offered them limited authority and limited responsibility in any other sphere. But why cats specifically? The dog had been domesticated for thousands of years and had a long, well-established tradition of being a beloved companion animal. The Victorians loved dogs too. Queen Victoria herself was famous for her devotion to her dogs, particularly her Cavalier King Charles Spaniels and her collies. Dogs were all over Victorian painting and photography and literature. But the cat occupied a peculiar position in Victorian culture that was, in many ways, more interesting than the dogs, because the cat, entering the Victorian period, was coming from a much lower starting point. The cat was climbing. For most of European history preceding the Victorian era, the domestic cat had a somewhat ambivalent reputation that swung between useful and suspect. The cat was associated, in the popular religious imagination, with witchcraft, the black cat as familiar, the cat as companion to women who operated outside the normal social order, the cat as a creature of the night and of secrets and of the feminine in its uncontrolled form. The Middle Ages and early modern period had been particularly unkind to cats in this regard. There were periods of systematic cat killing in European history, particularly in France and Germany, where cats were sometimes burned in public festivals on the grounds of their association with the devil. By the Victorian era, the outright persecution of cats was long over, but the ambivalence lingered. The dog was loyal, servile, openly affectionate, obedient, all the qualities that the dominant culture valued in subordinates, human and animal. The cat was independent, inscrutable, selectively affectionate at best, flatly indifferent at worst, and capable of doing exactly what it wanted regardless of what you wanted, which made it a constant source of both delight and mild exasperation for those who tried to manage it. The rehabilitation of the cat in Victorian culture, the process by which cats went from being ambivalently regarded utility animals with a slightly sinister historical reputation to being the beloved, pampered, photographed, bonneted darlings of the Victorian parlour, is one of the more interesting cultural stories of the century, and it happened relatively quickly, driven by several forces that were all operating simultaneously. The first force was Queen Victoria herself, who had opinions about almost everything and who was not shy about sharing them, and whose tastes were enormously influential on the class that was most anxious to follow them. Victoria liked cats, not as ardently as she liked dogs, but she kept them, named them, wrote about them in her journals, and in doing so gave the cat a kind of royal imprimatur that it had never quite had before. When the Queen of England treats her cats with affection and names them individual names and notes their personalities in her personal diary, the cultural message to the middle-class woman in Kensington or Manchester or Edinburgh is reasonably clear. This is a thing that respectable, even distinguished women do. The second force was the cat show. the first formal cat show in Britain, and arguably in the world, at least in the organised, competitive, standardised judging sense that the term cat show now implies, was held at Crystal Palace in London in 1871. It was organised by Harrison Weir, an illustrator and committed cat enthusiast who wrote extensively about cats and their care, and who had, for years, been nursing a conviction that the domestic cat was criminally underappreciated as an animal of beauty, variety, and interesting characteristics, and that what was needed was a public exhibition that would bring this to wider attention. The 1871 Crystal Palace Cat Show exhibited approximately 160 cats, attracted thousands of visitors, was covered extensively by the press, and was considered, by virtually every account of the day, an enormous success. Harrison Weir would later describe the reaction of the crowd with evident satisfaction. People were astonished, not just at the variety of cats, the different breeds, the different colourings, the different sizes, but at the cats themselves, presented in a context that demanded that they be looked at carefully, that their individual characteristics be noticed and assessed and compared. A cat show does something specific to the way people look at cats. It demands individual attention. Each cat in a judged exhibition is a specific cat, not simply a cat. It has specific characteristics that are being evaluated against a standard that make it more or less excellent in specific, measurable ways. Attending a cat show, or reading about one, produces a mode of attention to cats that is fundamentally different from the vague background awareness of cats as ambient household creatures. It produces the habit of looking, and the habit of looking, noticing the specific quality of a specific cat's markings, the particular expression of its eyes, the individual character that reveals itself in how it holds its body and what it does with its tail, is the beginning of the relationship that the Victorians were developing with their cats. You cannot anthropomorphize an animal you haven't looked at carefully. You cannot name it after an aristocrat. You cannot dress it in a bonnet. First, you have to actually see it. The third force was photography, and this is the one that connects most directly to the bonnets and the tea parties and the wedding dresses. Photography arrived in the early Victorian period. The daguerreotype from 1839, the calotype shortly after, the wet collodion process from the 1850s, the dry plate from the 1870s, and its development across the century, was a story of rapidly increasing accessibility and rapidly decreasing cost. By the 1870s and 1880s, having a portrait photograph taken was within the reach of the middle class, and the photographic studio had become a normal feature of Victorian commercial life in any substantial town. The photograph did something new to the relationship between people and things they cared about. Before photography, if you wanted a visual record of something, a person, a place, an animal, you needed either to make a drawing or painting yourself, or to commission one, which required skill you might not have, or money you might not want to spend. Most things, for most people, went unrecorded in this way. The beloved cat of 1840 left no image behind, only memory, and when it died it was simply gone from the visual record of the family as completely as if it had never existed. Photography changed this. Suddenly, a cat, a specific cat, your cat, with its specific face and its specific markings and its specific way of sitting that was entirely its own, could be recorded, could be preserved, could be shown to other people, carried in a case, displayed on the mantelpiece next to the portrait photographs of the children. And once cats could be photographed, the Victorian instinct for composition and for performance, a culture that was deeply theatrical in its approach to self-presentation, that understood itself to be constantly creating images of itself for internal and external audiences, took over. Because here is what happens when you try to photograph a cat. The cat does not sit still. This is the bedrock practical reality underlying the entire genre of Victorian cat photography, and it shapes everything that follows. The early photographic processes required relatively long exposure times, minutes in some cases, seconds in most cases, even after significant technical improvements. Photographing a moving subject produced a blur. Photographing a subject that moved unpredictably and frequently, like a cat, was genuinely difficult. The professional animal photographers of the Victorian period And there were professional animal photographers, a specialty that developed alongside the broader commercial photography industry, developed a range of techniques for managing this challenge. Some were technical, shorter exposure times achieved through better chemistry, better lenses, better lighting. Some were practical, working with individual animals over time, learning their habits and their tolerances, learning when they were likely to be still. And some were theatrical. If you want a cat to hold a position for long enough to photograph it, you can use food placed just out of frame. You can use another person, positioned just out of frame, holding the cat gently in position. You can use the specific drowsiness that follows a large meal, catching the cat in the postprandial stillness that is one of the few reliably motionless states in a cat's existence. And you can use costumes. Not as a first choice, perhaps, but as a discovery. Because what the Victorian animal photographers found, working with their subjects, was that a cat wearing clothing behaved differently than a cat not wearing clothing. Not dramatically differently, not in every case, but often enough to be worth noting. The mild bewilderment produced by the donning of a bonnet or a small jacket produced a brief period of uncharacteristic stillness as the cat processed the new and somewhat confusing information about its own appearance. A cat that had just been put into a dress was a cat that was, for a few seconds, thinking about the dress rather than about escaping the studio. Those few seconds were the photograph. The photographers who discovered this also discovered very quickly that their clients loved it. And this is where the story becomes most interesting, because the response to cat photography, the specific enthusiasm, the delight, the desire to commission more of it and display it and share it, was not entirely about cats. It was also about what the cat, costumed and composed and posed in elaborate scenes, was being used to say. The Victorian middle class had a very particular relationship with humour. This is a class that took itself seriously, that was, as we noted, preoccupied with respectability, with the correct performance of its own social standing, with the maintenance of dignity as a visible characteristic of the respectable household. This was a culture that had produced the stiff formal portrait as its dominant mode of self-representation, in which the subject sat or stood, with expressions ranging from solemn to severe, and that took the business of being photographed with corresponding seriousness. A photograph of a cat in a wedding dress, sitting at a miniature table with tiny cups and saucers arranged in front of it, is funny in a very specific way. It is funny because it takes the forms of dignified Victorian self-presentation. The formal portrait, the wedding photograph, the domestic scene of respectable household life, and it applies them with apparent earnestness to a cat. A cat that does not understand what a wedding dress means. A cat that does not understand the significance of a tea party. A cat that is, at the moment the photograph is taken, presumably thinking about fish. The joke is the gap between the seriousness of the form and the absurdity of the subject. And it is a joke that the Victorians, who lived so thoroughly inside the seriousness of the form, found genuinely, repeatedly hilarious. But the joke also had a second layer, which is where it becomes more interesting. The specific images of dressed cats that survive from this period, and there are enough of them, in enough variety, by enough different photographers to constitute a genuine genre, show cats in scenes that are not random. They show cats in domestic scenes. Cats at tea, cats at dinner tables, cats in wedding ceremonies, with a cat groom and a cat bride and cat attendants arranged in the formal configuration of a Victorian wedding photograph. Cats in parlours, with books and newspapers arranged around them in the manner of a Victorian domestic interior. These are scenes of middle-class Victorian domestic life, enacted by cats. And the women who commissioned these photographs, who brought their cats to the studios, or who had photographers come to their homes, who chose the costumes and the scenes and the props, were mostly middle-class Victorian women. This is not a coincidence. The middle-class Victorian woman lived in a world that was, in material terms, often comfortable, and in social terms, often significantly constrained. She managed the household, and managing a Victorian household was genuinely complex, skilled work involving the management of servants, the maintenance of accounts, the planning of meals and events and social obligations. But this management was not publicly recognized as skilled work. It was simply what women did, and it was not the kind of thing that generated public acknowledgement or professional status. She was educated, increasingly. The expansion of women's education across the Victorian period meant that by the 1870s and 1880s, many middle-class women had received considerably more formal education than their mothers had. She was intelligent, curious, and in many cases reading widely and thinking seriously about the world. And she was operating in a domestic sphere that offered limited outlet for intelligence and curiosity and seriousness, and in a public sphere that offered her limited entry. The cat, in this context, was a domestic companion that was entirely hers. Not the husband's domain, not the children's domain, not the employer's domain. Hers. She fed it, named it, cared for it, formed a relationship with it that was genuine and reciprocal in the specific way that the relationship between a person and a cat they've known for years becomes genuine and reciprocal. And the dressed-up cat photograph was, among other things, a woman exercising creativity and humor in a domain where she had authority. She was staging these scenes. She was directing them. She was making a joke, a specific, sophisticated joke about the forms of Victorian self-presentation. And she was the author of it. The cat in the bonnet was funny. It was also hers in a way that not many things were. Let's talk about specific photographs, because the general is less interesting than the particular, and some of these images are extraordinary. Harry Pointer was a Brighton photographer working in the 1870s and 1880s who became one of the first and most prolific producers of what he called cat poses. His cats were primarily a colony he maintained himself, presumably for the purpose, and the photographs he produced number in the hundreds. He sold them as carte de visite, small photographic cards printed in quantity, exchangeable as gifts and collectibles, which were among the most popular photographic formats of the period. Pointer's cats are doing things. They are riding bicycles, small ones, clearly props, with the cat arranged on the seat in a position suggesting motion. They are reading newspapers, the paper held up at a human angle, the cat's paws on either side of it in a posture unmistakably based on the common Victorian image of a gentleman reading in his armchair. They are roller skating. This was the 1870s, when roller skating had become a fashionable pursuit in Britain, and Pointer was alert enough to contemporary trends to put his cats on tiny roller skates and record them in attitudes of apparent velocity. They are wishing each other happy Christmas. They are bidding each other good morning. They are, in image after image, doing human things in human poses with human props, in photographs arranged to look like human portraits or human genre scenes. And the captions are everything. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Will you join me in a cup of tea? These are written in the first person of the cat, as though the cat is speaking, and the gap between the evident incomprehension of the cat and the words it is supposedly addressing to the viewer is the entire joke and the entire point. Harry Pointer's cat photographs were enormously popular. They sold in quantities that made him a successful commercial photographer, and they were exported beyond Britain. Copies exist in American collections, in European collections, suggesting that the international market for British cats doing human things was real and sustained. He was not unique. The genre of dressed and posed cat photography was widespread enough that it attracted multiple photographers working in this mode across Britain, France, Germany, and the United States in the 1880s and 1890s. Some of the most elaborate images come from France, where the genre reached a level of staging complexity that has to be seen to be believed. Photographic scenes involving 10 or 15 cats, elaborate costumes, miniature furniture, props of extraordinary specificity, arranged with a theatrical precision that suggests significant preparation time and significant patience. The French photographer whose work in this genre is perhaps most remembered, though his name was not always attached to the images that circulated, produced a series of photographs depicting cats in scenes of human domestic life that included a barbershop scene, with one cat being shaved and several others waiting, their expressions of vague affront captured at the specific moment that photographic exposure required, a kitchen scene, a schoolroom scene, a billiard room, each one staged with careful attention to the human conventions of the scene being parodied, and each one made funny, only funny, entirely funny, by the cats. Here is a question worth asking. Why is it funny? Because the images are funny. This is not a contested point. There is something about the cat in bonnet image that produces laughter in virtually everyone who sees it, across cultures and across time, as the continued virality of Victorian cat photographs in the 21st century demonstrates. But why? What is the specific mechanism of the joke? The most obvious answer is incongruity. The mismatch between the dignity of the form and the obvious unsuitability of the subject. This is a real component. A cat does not understand a tea party, and the sight of a cat surrounded by tea party props is funny because we know the cat doesn't understand any of it, and the cat's expression, which cats reliably produce regardless of their actual emotional state of vaguely offended indifference, is somehow perfect for the situation. But there's a second mechanism, which the best of these images exploit more deliberately than they're usually given credit for. The best Victorian cat photographs are funny because the cats look like specific people. Not like generic people, like specific Victorian people, like the specific social types of the Victorian middle class, the types that the Victorian satirical press had been drawing and lampooning for decades. The cat in the newspaper, with its studied expression of informed gravity, is a specific kind of Victorian gentleman, the kind who reads the paper at breakfast and has opinions on the Eastern question. The cats at the wedding are specific Victorian social roles: bride, groom, best man, matron of honour, with all of the attendant anxieties and performances of those roles encoded in their arrangement. The cat at the tea table is a specific Victorian social performer, someone going through the precise ritual of tea-giving with the deliberate formality that the ritual demands. And because cats, in their actual physical expressiveness, have a range of expressions that overlap with the range of human expressions that the Victorian middle class worked hardest to project, the studied neutrality, the polite interest, the mild affront, the watchful awareness of social hierarchy, the photographs achieve something that is more than a simple substitution of cat for person. They achieve a moment of genuine recognition in which the cat looks, for a fraction of a second, like someone you might actually know. That recognition, that moment of, yes, that cat looks exactly like so-and-so, is the core joke, and it is a sophisticated one. It is a joke that requires the viewer to know the social types being parodied, to recognize them, and to find in the recognition something that releases the tension of living inside the social performance being parodied. The cats are safe. That's part of why it works. You can laugh at the cat reading the newspaper in a way that you cannot laugh at your husband reading the newspaper, even if the resemblance is exact. The cat provides distance, and distance makes the comedy possible. There is a thread of genuine affection running through all of this, and it would be wrong to follow the comedy and the sociology without acknowledging it. The women who dressed their cats and commissioned their photographs were not primarily being satirists. They were not primarily being sociologists. They were primarily people who loved their cats and who expressed that love in the idiom available to them, which was the idiom of the Victorian domestic interior, with its elaborate organization of space and objects and appearances. The letters and diaries of Victorian middle-class women are full of their cats, not incidentally, extensively in the way you write about things that genuinely matter to you. Names, personalities, specific behaviors, specific preferences, the grief of the death of a cat that had lived with you for 12 or 15 years. These are real relationships, described with the same emotional vocabulary that Victorian women used for their human relationships. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, one of the more significant things about the Victorian cat phenomenon, that it represents an era in which the relationship between human beings and domestic animals was being elevated explicitly and deliberately from utility to genuine attachment, and in which the emotional lives of animals were being taken seriously in ways that were new and that required the development of new language and new practices for their expression. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals had been founded in 1824. The animal welfare movement that it represented was not simply about preventing cruelty in the abstract sense. It was also about asserting that animals had feelings, that their suffering mattered, that the relationship between human beings and animals was a moral relationship with obligations on the human side. The woman who dressed Marmaduke in a bonnet and laughed at the photograph was operating in the same cultural moment as the woman who testified at an RSPCA prosecution about animal mistreatment. Both of them were insisting, in their different ways, that this animal matters, that it deserves attention and care and consideration, that it is not nothing. The bonnet was funny, it was also a kind of love. By the 1890s, the genre of cat photography had expanded beyond the studio into something very much like mass media, the development of the half-tone printing process, which allowed photographic images to be reproduced in newspapers and magazines alongside text, rather than only as separate prints or inserts, meant that cat images could appear in periodicals, which meant they could reach audiences of hundreds of thousands of people, which meant that the appetite for cat images and cat stories and cat humor that we had previously thought of as a middle-class parlor phenomenon turned out to be an appetite with genuinely mass dimensions. Louis Wain was the most famous British cat artist of the late Victorian and Edwardian period, and his career illustrates this expansion almost perfectly. Wain began by drawing cats from observation, producing detailed naturalistic studies. He was asked by the Illustrated London News to produce a cat illustration for their Christmas edition in 1886. Cats at a human Christmas party, arranged around a human scene, and behaving as humans behave. It was enormously popular. He was asked for more. He produced more. The cats he drew became progressively more anthropomorphized as his career progressed. Not dressed cats exactly, but cats with human expressions, human postures, human social dynamics, engaged in the full range of Victorian social comedy. Wain became one of the best-selling illustrators in Britain, producing cat imagery for postcards, for books, for advertisements, for everything that required a cat. His cats were recognizable across the country in a way that no previous cat imagery had been. They were characters in the way that fictional characters are characters, consistent personalities, consistent ways of inhabiting their world, consistent and recognizable to an audience that had made them part of shared culture. The internet cat has a Victorian great-grandmother, and her name is probably Marmaduke, and she is sitting in a bonnet in a photographer's studio in Brighton, waiting for this to be over so she can go back to the fire. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves its own space, and it is the dimension that is easiest to overlook because it is the most quotidian, the most simply, daily, human. The dressed cat, the photographed cat, the named and loved and grieved over cat. These things represent the beginnings of a shift in the human relationship to the domestic animal that has continued, accelerating to the present day. We are now in a cultural moment where the bond between human beings and their pets is taken more seriously, legally and emotionally and practically than at any previous point in human history. Pets in many legal systems have moved from the category of property towards something approaching personhood. Still property in most jurisdictions, but property with a special status, whose suffering matters legally in ways it did not before. The emotional landscape of this shift, the way people talk about their pets, the way the loss of a pet is publicly acknowledged and mourned, the way the pet's personality is described and remembered, looks a great deal like the landscape the Victorians were building. The language we use for our relationships with our animals, the space we give those relationships in our emotional lives, the extent to which we consider an animal's preferences and comfort and well-being in our daily decisions. All of this has ancestors in the Victorian parlour, in the cat shows of Crystal Palace, in the careful grief that Victorian women recorded in their diaries when their cats died. We did not invent loving our pets, but the specific form that modern pet love takes, the sentimental, the anthropomorphizing, the photographed and shared and publicly expressed affection. That form was largely invented in the Victorian era by women in parlours with cats that had names. Marmaduke, sitting by the fire, enduring the bonnet with the studied patience of a creature that has decided to allow this provisionally because the person insisting on it is the person who provides the fish. The photographs are still funny. They're funny because cats, fundamentally, do not care what you think about them. And the photographs document this with accidental precision. Every Victorian cat photograph is, at some level, a photograph of a cat tolerating a situation while privately reserving its opinion. The cat in the wedding dress is not celebrating marriage. The cat at the tea table is not performing hospitality. The cat on the bicycle is certainly not planning to go anywhere on the bicycle. They are simply there, in their clothes, with their expressions, doing the thing that cats have done for the entire span of their relationship with human beings, which is to permit human foolishness to proceed, at whatever distance from them that human foolishness can be made to proceed, on the implicit understanding that the fish will continue to arrive regardless. We are still doing this. The cat in the costume, photographed and shared online, is functionally identical to Harry Pointer's cats on their roller skates. A joke about the incongruity between animal and human, between the dignity of form and the reality of subject, between what we want from our cats and what our cats will allow. The mechanism of the joke has not changed. The technology has changed. The cats have remained exactly the same. This is, when you think about it, the most Victorian possible thing about the whole business. The Victorian era believed in progress, in the forward march of civilization, in the steady improvement of human life through industry and science and social reform. And yet here is one thing that progress has not touched at all. The cat, in its bonnet, looking back at you with an expression of magnificent indifference to your plans for it, not because it is incapable of cooperation, but because cooperation, in this specific instance, has not been deemed worth its while. 150 years of human progress. Same cat. The Victorians would have laughed. They did laugh. They put the photograph on the mantelpiece and showed it to their guests and told the story of how the bonnet went on. And they laughed at all of it. And the cat sat near the fire and did not participate in the laughter. And everything about this situation was perfect. Harry Pointer produced over 200 individual cat pose photographs between 1871 and the 1880s. His work was commercially successful enough that he made his living from it. He is believed to have maintained a colony of cats specifically for photographic purposes. He does not appear to have found this unusual. Neither did anyone who bought his work, which was most of Britain. If you watched this far, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. See you next time.